Hello and welcome again to our CantCon tourney recap. We've just finished a game of Frostbite against an extremely competent Starco player where we had to battle forward under electromagnetic bombardment from Emily and Overwatch from a Nauf that would not die, where we managed a 7-point win despite our own bad judgment in the last round, which cost us 3 objective points. Still, that was a 7-point win, which means we're well placed going into round 2. Round 2 would be Acquisition, and we're matched up against an Ariadna player. Now for this matchup, I actually selected a relatively hacking heavy list, which you'll see on screen now. This list is fairly tried and tested, and it'll be relatively familiar. I posted at least one game on this channel previously with a list that is similar to this, although I've made one small tweak since then. In the last version of this list, we were trying out a bike in Combat Group 2, which I've replaced with a Taiga creature. Now, I do actually think the bike is a worthy 2-point upgrade over the 6-point Taiga. The potential for high roll off of booty, as well as the ability to present both the SMG and dual chain cult threat, makes it a really nice piece even before the upgrades given to bikes this season. But I needed to find those 2 points because I wanted to upgrade an R-drone to an Icadron. And that's because I value baggage fairly highly in this list, and it had some fragile games beforehand where the absence of baggage could have been quite perilous. And in particular, that's because I've been using Bit and Kiss heavily to establish repeater networks. And in the absence of baggage, you're basically one and done with their pitches. Bit will unload both of his pitches in one volley, and Kiss will fire off both of hers in 2. But if you have capacity to reload, you can reload Bit in between, a Kiss in between, and across 3 orders fire 6 pitches, which is much more reliable. It doesn't force you to fall back on their deployable repeaters to get your network established. And I wanted to just have that layer of insurance. And it's not like Taiga creatures are bad. I was happy to have a second one in my list. Now, despite the fact that this is hacking heavy, I chose to play this against Ariadna for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I'm very comfortable with this list. It does what I want and it does it well. Secondly, it's got lots of hackers in it, which in Acquisition makes pressing the buttons a bit of a charm. Finally, hacking is not particularly bad against Ariadna. Spotlight is still highly viable against them, and they don't want to take Spotlight AROs or missile attacks. And the Umbra the Anathematics Sepsitor, which I had in my second list, obviously does nothing against Ariadna. So this list I felt relatively comfortable, and I decided to drop it, and as a bit of a spoiler, I would also do that for a similar reason in the final round. Now, the Lieutenant role here, I think I lost, and my opponent elected to take first turn. This is an interesting one in Acquisition, because the deployment zones are so close, attacking is very easy, but the scoring is all end of game. So it's one of the most finely balanced scenarios in terms of whether or not you want to go first or second. My opponent chose to go first, and I set up on this side of the table that you can see before you. I chose this side because it had the quickest access to this high ground, which I quite wanted to have be able to access basically, including some ability to deploy along the high ground here thanks to the 16-inch deployment zone. Similarly, I expected my opponent to have at least a tank hunter in his list, and I wanted to deny positions that basically deny really, really good positions for the tank hunter and force it to go down in relatively predictable locations. And as we can see, this is my opponent's list for this game. This is a bit of a reconstruction. I've asked him for a copy of the list, but he's been offline for a couple of days. But this is everything that was in the list. I'm not sure if the combat groups are exactly accurate, but you can see basically a lot of the high points of Ariadna there. Colonel Veronin, who is excellent, 2 SAS forward observers, who are excellent, the Unknown Ranger, who is excellent. He's gone relatively heavy on the bikes this game, with a Maverick submachine gun light rocket launcher and a Desperado, and of course the free motorized bounty hunter that you get in Acquisition. 3 bikes being about as many as you can expect to safely deploy on most maps, at least that we play locally. He's also got a Nomandina, which he's a big fan of, and he's using 2 chasseurs to round out his forward deploying camouflage elements. I think chasseurs in this edition are just fine. They're not bad, they're just fine. And if you have low expectations of them, that's totally okay. They aren't the terrors that they were in N3, but they still do totally alright. And they did totally alright this game. Also interesting to note, there's the Para Commando with +1 damage on the boarding shotgun, which would come into play during the game. And then he's got, taking a leaf out of what I would call the Netherlands approach to Ariadna, 1 tank hunter, but then 2 metros with Panzerfausts. He's also got a Briscard, which is an MSV-1 trooper with heavy rocket launcher and assault pistol, which he basically uses as an ARO piece when he needs something that has MSV-1 against enemy smoke warbands. And those are relatively common, and the Briscard really is very cheap at 19 points. Now, as a little bit of background, one of the reasons why I was confident my opponent would have a tank hunter is that I played a game, in this case Frostbite, against this opponent about a week before the event. And it was the most traumatizingly one-sided game I have ever played. The Tank Hunter missile launcher crit me 5 times in ARO on the first turn, I think again twice on the second turn, basically did not lose a face-to-face roll or fail an armor save all game, and I have never been so thoroughly trounced by a single model in my entire life. So I expected the Tank Hunter, because after that performance I would have one in every list all the time forever, and indeed there was a single mimetism -3 camouflage marker in my opponent's deployment zone. The Metros, however, are an interesting addition. They sort of round out your coverage. They are regular, they are only 12 points. Now the risk obviously is that you're putting a 12-point regular order on Overwatch, but they fulfill a similar role to Delamy. They're only a little more expensive, or they're 50% more expensive, that's 4 points. And they give you regular orders. They never have to be revealed. There are certain things in this list that I would change, little flourishes here and there, but as a core, the pieces that are being used here are very effective. So this photo was taken before my deployment, but I'll sort of broadly run through what I was thinking. And what I wanted to do here is I wanted to set up a forward defense. I wanted a defense in depth. You don't always want to do that. Basically in acquisition, which is the 16-inch deployment zone, sometimes you want to use the bottom of your deployment zone. You want to try and minimize your opponent's distance advantage by not deploying close to them. But because I have a good hacking network, I wanted to make use of that. So my opponent has deployed here in this picture, and basically what you can see are camouflage marker with mimetism, camouflage marker. So the Metros have played their hand. But then basically there's just a smattering of camouflage markers across the center line. Any of, Libertoses and Chasseurs and etc. Could be anything with up to 4 deployment 8 because of the deployment 16 inches in this scenario. And then there is the Briscard is hanging out just down here, so it's got to lock down this line of the table. And then Veronin is is hanging out prone at the very back of the deployment zone in that building there. Now I think I could potentially have seen him from this rooftop, but it was a close run thing. Without getting a model actually out there, I wouldn't have been able to be sure. I think it would have had to have been the Raicho vaulting over this sign, which would have given it enough height to be able to make the plunging fire. Now, that's for real. I think I needed that much height even to see Veronin silhouette for base. The Corvus Belli terrain has really generous ramparts. It's actually often really hard to get plunging fire down onto these buildings, which honestly I think is a feature, not a bug. And then there are just bikes smattered around, behind various bits of total cover. So what I end up going and doing, after a lot of looking and thinking about what I can sort of best do to maximize my advantage here, the Raicho stays in reserve because it's the most expensive piece. But I end up with, basically, between Bit and Kiss and my repeater network, I end up with a hacking network that extends pretty much, all the way across the table. As far forward to the center, in some cases reaching to the center line, thanks to the 16 plus 8-inch repeater zone. So he can't really move at me without taking spotlight arrows. So for example, up here we have Bit's deployable repeater, and the full actual deployment is we will end up with Bit and Kiss hanging out here, the Libertos on defense sort of in the midfield, Bit's deployable repeater, Datarazi and Taegis just in places where they are safe, so there'll be like a Datarazi there, a Datarazi there, a Datarazi there. So I can see my opponent's Overwatch at this point. So and you have to eyeball this, you can't pre-measure it, but I'm reasonably good at eyeballing 4 inches. All of my Datarazi are positioned in places where a 4-inch move won't expose them to any of those camouflage markers. The Biker is hanging out here. Now, it will be running into the Briscard if it advances, but on the other hand, it's got a Red Fury. But I mostly just want it looking up towards this this table edge. And we've got a missile drone hanging out. It's sort of like, you can't actually see it on this thing, but it's hanging out here, basically, or a little bit that direction, so that it can see all the way along this table edge. The Charontid and Umbra are both positioned relatively far forward. The Charontid is nooked in there, and the Umbra is nooked in there. each with some kind of a bodyguard, a Taiga creature or Dadarasi, so that an attack on them has something that's good at dodging to potentially defend them. And I'll just mark those with, yeah, circles and dots. So these are my two like uber pieces in the first combat group, and then eventually the Riot Show will drop down here. Now my opponent's reserve drops are the Unknown Ranger, who turns up behind this crate down there. I actually don't remember what they say. Oh, he tries to infiltrate. Tries to hard roll to infiltrate one of those SAS. Now this is a move I guess we'd call the old Ariadna and Fidei, where even if you don't have Usha, you've got high enough fizz that you can just go for it. And he tries to infiltrate the SAS up there, and lucky for me, he fails. Now again, fizz 13, you need to roll a 10, 50% chance to do it. If you're going to do this, I actually favor doing it with things like hard cases that are kind of disposable. It's actually not bad to do it with chasseurs either. A chasseur is 20 points most of the time. And if you fail a roll with a chasseur, okay, it's 20-point regular order in your deployment zone. It can be well worth, as an Ariadna player, just making those rolls with a few of your infiltrators and seeing what happens. SAS are a little risky to do it with because they're one of your higher value pieces despite being about the same points cost, but you can have a go. But I think chasseur mind layers in particular is mimicking some of that effect of the speculo for relatively, particularly the Shasvastio speculo, for a relatively cheap cost. Now my Riot Show's position is chosen pretty carefully, and it's pushed back basically against this building to have very controlled lines of fire. Now it can see this camouflage marker, but I am keeping it away from the dreaded crit machine. But it's got a good line down this exposed table area, exposed table side, and then up that table, that long fire lane there. And that's because I want to pin back, to the extent possible, my opponent's bikes, particularly the ones that are deployed in that part of the table. The Maverick, I can't do anything about. It's over on the other side of the table, but if it moves forward and attacks, it's the most expensive one. And I'm comfortable engaging that with like templates. My Bounty Hunter, for example, has rolled a flamethrower. One of the main things to note about this deployment is that every inch, without exception, of my deployment zone, table edge, is covered in case of Van Zant. My opponent has too many camouflage markers to be sure whether or not he has pieces missing until the order count is done. But before that point, it's worth being safe. And this table edge, so there are some spots, again, not shown on this this view of the table, but you can see here that, for example, this building here offers a quite nice nook for Van Zant to crawl in on, which is something that I wanted to avoid. So we've got good coverage of all of the deployment zones, I've got a repeater network in place, and I've got template weapons covering the approaches as best I can. I'm prepared to defend. So my opponent begins his attack basically with the Unknown Ranger just fucking coming straight at me. And the Unknown Ranger moves from this position here and in a straight line towards my Chirontid. Now, at this point, the Libertos, who is hanging out here, gives his life for the cause. He reveals when the Unknown Ranger crests that low rise there to take a shot, puts a template on him. Unknown Ranger passes the save and just gats him for his trouble. The Libertos ends up going dogged, tries to guts into cover, ends up dodging. The Unknown Ranger basically at this point begins to ignore the Libertos and keep moving in this direction, which the Libertos basically uses to make another dodge since he's dogged into a line of fire of a mine over here, and then dodge again. Unfortunately, what I'm trying to do is just use the dogged Libertos to trigger a mine to save me some time in a subsequent turn. And the Libertos does trigger the mine on the third ARO against the Unknown Ranger, but unfortunately does not make his dodge, needing a 13, and doesn't make his armor roll, and dies. So at this point, the Unknown Ranger is pushing into my deployment zone, but with the caveat that as he's moved along this line here, he's had to pass through my repeater network, and he's gotten spotlit. Now, at this point, my opponent has to decide whether or not he wants to take a risk. So if you recall, my Chirontid is hanging out here with a Taiga creature nearby. My opponent could hug this wall, engaging the Taiga creature, taking more AROs or allowing the Chirontid to dodge, before trying to close to CC with the Chirontid. If it does this, it'll be taking dodges or template attacks from the Taiga creature, and eventually there's the risk that the Chirontid will just be able to dodge and catch him in, basically make a dodge that ruins things for him. Alternatively, he can hug this building's wall and just see everything all at once, and take an immediate face-to-face roll with the Carontid. And what he wants to do here basically is force the issue as quickly as possible and also avoid the Tega creature's chain cult, at least for the first ARO. And he eyeballs that and figures that he can do it. This is the riskier play, but it gets the Unknown Ranger immediately into a face-to-face roll with the Carontid, which he hopes that he can win decisively quickly. Failing that, close to CC and finish the Carontid off. The Tega dodges, the Unknown Ranger basically goes and sprays the Carontid down, but thanks to targeted, the Carontid needs a 17 to hit, and I roll like a 15 or a 16 or something. The Unknown Ranger does not beat that. It's a hit mode plasma impact, and that's 2 saves. The Unknown Ranger fails both of them and dies. So I've lost the Libertas, but this has cost my opponent actually not that many orders because he moved in such straight lines and moved for that aggressive play immediately. But it's cost my opponent a really big, really expensive piece. So that's a win for me. I have to hold now for the rest of my turn. And what the rest of the turn consists of are extremely aggressive attacks up these parts of the board with bikes and my opponent's Libertas. Now, this ends up getting... This is an interesting one because what he does first is he moves Desperado, throws some smoke, and then the Red Fury Mimetism -6, yeah, he rolled that, Bounty Hunter, basically blitzes towards the Riker. Wins the face-to-face roll. It crits, which the Riker only does not take any extra saves from. It does mean I have to take 4 saves, and I need to roll 3s to pass, and I take a wound. So the Raicho's taken 1. The Bounty Hunter blitzes forward again. This time it makes the same face-to-face roll, but it gets got by a Tega creature and goes unconscious. The Raicho is not wounded again. However, it's already wounded once, and with the remaining orders in the turn, my opponent moves a camouflage marker with no mimetism up this direction, runs at the Riker, reveals to be a Libertas, and shotguns him, template mode. And I take another wound on the Riker. The good news is that the Samaritan, now because it's the last order of the turn, rather than trying to kill the Libertas, the Samaritan and the Datarazi that are hanging out here both dodge, and the Samaritan succeeds and gets into close combat. The bad news is the Raiko has taken 2 wounds from damage 13 hits. This is also, and this game in particular is a bit of a showcase of the weakness of taking the cheapest Raicho profile. It does not have a heavy flamethrower. It has a heavy rocket launcher instead. Now, I think that is a totally fair trade, and I take the cheapest one of those profiles in this version of the list because my lieutenant will always be spending his own regular order, whereas in a list that, say, is running a less active lieutenant, upgrading to the NCO profile can be very worthwhile. But I think the HRL is a fine weapon, and the fact that it's an impact template weapon can sometimes get you kills in active and reactive that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But in this case, the lack of a close-in defense, you're relying on other things to protect you, it kind of mattered. I didn't get to just flamethrower the Libertas. Now, on this turn, that was going to be an advantage, because my immediate activation next turn is the Samaritan just eats the Libertas and goes to full power. So that's fantastic. I've got a 3-wound, no wounding cap Samaritan. But the Riker is wounded. And the fact that the Riker has no wounds left means that I kind of am locked out of using it aggressively for the rest of the game. I could try and discover shoot this what I suspect is a Metro, but doing so means that I'm exposed to, if I just don't win the face-to-face roll, I'm probably dead, because a 1-wound Raiko is just not going to succeed. It's going to lose that. It's not going to pass its armor rolls if I don't win the face-to-face roll. Even though I'm favored to do so, the risk-reward suddenly becomes kind of bad. But that's fine. I'm in a pretty good position. I don't have to do a lot to win if nothing changes. Now, my opponent will have an aggressive second turn, but I'm in a position right now where the status quo favors me, and so what I'm actually looking for is a way to just kind of make nothing change. So what I do is, the first thing, establish a lead. So the Umbra Samaritan moves around this way, which it can safely do so, up here, and it moves up to boop this button. A Tega creature follows along behind, attempts to do some discovering of these camouflage markers, but it doesn't succeed. That's fine. On this flank, and the bulk of the first combat group's orders, I lay down some smoke. I impersonate Bit and Kiss using Cyber Mask, and then move up here, and then Kiss stands up on this building here and fires some pitches. Something like that. Which lets me, and he lands one of them, needing 14s, which lets me spotlight Veronin and fucking drop a missile on his head. Now, that took a whole bunch of orders, and it killed one model. It was a really important model. I actually have like 3 orders left at this point, so I also spotlight the... there's something around here, the Briscard, and I drop a missile on his head as well. I think that cost pretty much, like, apart from the orders the Samaritan had to spend, I'd spent about 4 orders on the Samaritan getting into position, which meant I spent 7 orders getting those kills with missiles, and I was lucky to get the second one. I would have been very satisfied with the first. So I killed, in this turn, 2 models. But they were really important models. In particular, Veronin was really important, because my opponent is now down Strategos in loss of Lieutenant, and he's bled resources trying to attack me on the first turn. So I've established an advantage. I've also pressed a button. I've established an advantage that I can ride into subsequent turns. My opponent realizes that basically he's kind of in Schitt's Creek, and he has to do something to take the game back, because if he just passes through loss of Lieutenant, I'll have more time to establish an advantage, and basically the game will snowball against him. He tries to move some pieces around, doesn't quite succeed. This SAS forward observer, what happened to it? It ran through something that killed it. It made a break for it and failed, basically. Because he's having to play very aggressively. I think it had to run through a Libertos mine to try and make a play on bit. But then what he does do is he brings on the Paracommando there. And this is a decisive point where, you know what, it would have been really nice to have a flamethrower on that Raiko. Because she shoots, but it's mimetism in bad range. And I whiff. And the Paracommando then just runs at me and lays down the shotgun template. Now I hit her the second time, and I blow her out, but the 2 damage 15 shotguns kill the Raicho. So, womp womp, Raicho dies to basically a bunch of damage, 13 and 14 hits. But no, 15 templates is you can't be sad about dying to that as a tag. But so the Raicho is down, and that's the biggest casualty of the turn, and in fact the game. I'm not going to lose much more other than Tigers and the Libertos that I lost in the first round. That offensive action, which kills the Raicho, which is significant, basically takes all of my opponent's effort. I'm kind of alright with that, and this is something that this list will do. You will lose that tag a lot, but often that's all you will lose, and it will leave your first combat group fully intact. Tigers are dead, maybe one other thing in the first combat group is dead. The Libertos is dead, but when the Libertos dies, it goes all the way to dead, which means it always leaves a combat group spot spare. So I use a command token, and I flip an Imatron into the first combat group, and we're back at 10 orders, and the game continues. Now, with those casualties to my opponent, I'm actually a little concerned that he's running close to retreat. I don't think he's in retreat yet, but I learned my lesson from the previous game, and I stop and I do a bit of a count. And by my figuring, I can kill maybe 2 things before I have to be careful. Now, something to note here is I still have not engaged this Tank Hunter. Oh, that's the rest of what he did with that turn. The Tank Hunter revealed and fired missiles at the repeaters until it killed it, and then recamouflaged. Veronin has 5 command tokens, so he was able to do a lot of all of this. I have not engaged this Tank Hunter directly, nor do I fucking intend to, because engaging the Tank Hunter directly, particularly with the pieces I have left, can only hurt me. So what I want to do now is just establish more of an advantage. We sort of just, again, we really just do simple things here. So the Datarazi that was here drops some smoke down there, and then Bit goes and presses the button, and then runs back and hides on the stairs. That is honestly the only significant thing that I can remember doing on my second turn. I've confirmed the existence of 15 combat troopers at this point. The Carontid has... No, there is one other thing. So this was a piece of good luck / planning on my first turn, which is that the Umbra had ended up here. Now, that meant that the Desperado that was hanging out behind this tower was within 8 inches, which meant that if it impetuoused, it had to impetuous into the Umbra Samaritan, which is a bad deal. Even if that Desperado comes in full burst and rolls 5 dice, or 2 dice in melee with its pistols, it is massively unlikely to beat the Samaritan in close combat. So my opponent had to not use the Precious Impetuous activation on the Desperado and wait. Desperado still ended up around here. It had engaged and shot the Samaritan a couple of times. I think I'd lost the 2 wounds that I picked up, but the Samaritan just went into melee and killed the Dynamo, killed the Desperado, and was back on full health. Full health. So this was very much one of those games where the Samaritan ended up in this position where my opponent had to try and come and engage it, and there was nothing that he could. The final attempt that he would make over the course of the game is that he would run an SAS into close combat with it, which is the best chance that he had. The SAS surprise attack gave him a tiny numerical advantage against the Umbra Samaritan for one combat activation, where he needed to do 4 wounds to me in that activation to carry it through, or win twice, the second time being at a significant CC disadvantage. As it happened, he lost the first face-to-face roll, which was not even particularly weird, and down he went, basically. So he put multiple things into this Umbra Samaritan, and it just lived the entire game because it's an absolute beast mode when it gets rolling, because it's a Prothean model. It's a high-quality Prothean model, and high-quality Prothean models are awesome. We saw that in the last game with Sheshkin, where she bailed me out in a big way. So a lot of this time I just spent making sure buttons are pressed, pulling things into defensive positions, cording my opponent off, and that pays off, basically. He's not in retreat, but he's very close. He has to do the count on his last turn. He's got a lieutenant again this turn, but really he's up against the wall. Some chasseurs make some valiant attempts to get into positions. One chasseur will end up sitting in a marker state on this objective. Now that won't control it, but it will contest it. But he's not really able to do anything else. I have a very simple last turn where the Umbra dodges out onto this objective, Bit dodges out onto this objective, and that's to avoid Tank Hunter ARO. And then the Torontid, with full order pool basically behind him, Cyber Masks, moves around here. That gets him through Overwatch from the Tank Hunter, which is the only thing that could have killed him. And then we have basically a Discover against the Chasseur here. And my opponent likes not to ARO. He could have Flamethrowered here and gone for the very, very long shot of burning the Torontid out. But he hopes that I'll fail the Discover roll, but I need 16s. I don't, I blow him away. I move on to the objective, and I am securing the HVT. I had mapping as my classified for this one, which is actually in acquisition is easier to do than anywhere, because with mapping you have to have a hacker or forward observer in base contact with a piece of terrain totally within the enemy deployment zone, which sucks in a 12-inch deployment zone scenario. It doesn't suck as much in a 16-inch deployment zone scenario, but I'm securing the HVT, which is just easier in this particular case. So I've gone, in this game, I've rallied a little bit from the previous game, and I've gone 10 points. I've pressed all the buttons, I'm controlling all of the buttons, I'm controlling the central antenna, I've done my classified through securing the HVT, and we have a strong win, avenging myself against the never having actually, I don't know if the grudge is still outstanding against the Tank Hunter crit machine, because I just didn't fight it this game, because why would I do that? I was able to win the game through other means, and I think they worked really well. So that's how this game played. It was much more controlled, and this list, the Jabberwocky list, is a really kind of controlling list. It can be undone a few different ways, particularly some sort of key assassination attempts. You can unpick pieces that unpick its ability to persecute that kind of remote warfare. But if you do that, we'd still got a Torontid, which is a super heavy infantry with a marker state and hacking and a plasma rifle and a Raicho and a bunch of Datarazi and etc. So it worked really well. It worked a charm. I got a lot of muscle memory with this list, which means the fact that I had been playing Toha for 2 weeks before the event didn't stummy me. I remembered how to play this list in time to win the game. So that was a 10-0 win, which made us likely to go undefeated. Not just go undefeated, but undefeated and playing for first in the final round. At this point, the Spiral player, that's Ed, was, I think, undefeated on a full 20 points, and beast moding his way through the tournament. One of the Sujan Yuching players had played against the other combined army player who was undefeated, and they had not quite knocked each other out, but that had been an incredibly close game. The combined army player won, but it was a very, very close run thing. And I believe at this point the other undefeated player was a Nomad player from Melbourne who was playing vanilla Nomads and tearing up a storm, doing really well. And so the final matchup would begin anon, and that would be in Quadrant Control. So stay tuned for that, coming up next.